you that Rome's greatest enemy was not Hannibal, Spartacus, or barbarian hordes. That enemy was ordinary hunger. Every military campaign, every legendary march, and every siege was, first and foremost, a grand logistical challenge. The Roman military machine was a marvel of its time, but this marvel ran on the simplest of fuels: food. The movement of a single legion required the daily delivery of tons of food, and any failure in this system was more terrifying than any enemy sword. It was an invisible war that Rome fought every day, and the fate of the empire depended on its outcome. There were no loud battles or triumphal arches in this war. Its heroes were not commanders, but quaestors, quartermasters, and ordinary soldiers grinding grain in hand mills. This is a story about how the stomach ruled the sword and logistics decided the outcome of wars. Watch the video to the end to find out how Rome created a system that allowed it to feed hundreds of thousands of soldiers far from home, and which drink was more important than water for a legionnaire. What if I told you that absolutely everything you believed about the invincible Roman army and its successes is incomplete and misses a critical aspect? We rightly admire its iron discipline and superb tactics in battle, but we often forget or underestimate that its real hidden strength lay in its unique ability to methodically solve incredibly complex mathematical and logistical supply problems. The main one was a complex equation of survival, in which on one side there were always thousands of hungry soldiers demanding food every day, and on the other, tons of grain and provisions that had to be delivered smoothly and on time from distant sources. Without solving this equation, any army, no matter how brave, was doomed to starvation or mutiny long before meeting the enemy on the battlefield. Let's look at the numbers to really understand the scale of the logistical problem of supply. A standard full legion during the heyday of the empire in the 1st-2nd centuries AD consisted of about 5,000 combat-ready men under arms, not counting auxiliary units. The daily grain consumption rate for one adult active soldier, as established by military doctors, was approximately 850 grams of pure grain per day, or 3 Roman pounds according to their system of measurement. This was the minimum rate for maintaining combat readiness and health, providing about 3,000 calories per day, taking into account other foods. Mathematically, this means that a single legion of 5,000 men consumed a colossal 4¼ tons of grain alone every single day without interruption. And if the invading army consisted of several legions at once, such as Caesar's 8 legions in his Gallic campaigns, this astronomical number grew to 30 to 40 tons of grain daily for the men alone. To this enormous number, it is necessary to add a significant amount of feed, hay and oats, for the many hundreds of pack animals, horses and mules in the army's baggage train, without which the army could not move. The animals ate as much as the people, doubling the logistical burden on the supply system. Now let's visualize this abstract number in understandable images to grasp the scale. 4 tons of dry grain is about 80 large sacks weighing 50 kilograms each, piled up in a mountain. To transport them all at once along the roads, it took about 20 heavy 4-wheeled carts, pulled by pairs of sturdy mules, or even more individual pack animals with bundles on their sides. It was a whole caravan, stretching for kilometers along the road and moving slower than the infantry. And this was only the minimum daily requirement for a single legion for one day of marching or camping. This long caravan of creaking carts had to arrive safely at the camp every single day without exception, failure, or delay for any reason. Any mistake, even a minor one, in the complex calculations of the quartermasters, or any unforeseen problem on the dangerous road, a broken bridge, an enemy ambush, a storm, meant disaster. The next day, tens of thousands of soldiers would simply have nothing to eat and famine would begin. A hungry army quickly loses its combat effectiveness and discipline, turning into an uncontrollable mob of looters. The logistical problem was greatly complicated by the critical fact that an army on the march was constantly on the move in unfamiliar terrain, rather than standing still. Vulnerable supply lines stretched for hundreds of kilometers from bases across hostile enemy territory, where every bush could conceal an ambush. It was necessary not only to organize the delivery of provisions from point A to point B, but also to reliably protect the precious convoys from constant attacks by enemy partisans and robbers, allocating a significant part of the fighting forces for this purpose. The loss of even one convoy could put the army on the brink of starvation and force it to retreat, which was a disgrace for the commander. Thus, every military campaign was in reality a tense race against time, distance, and dwindling supplies. A successful commander had to be not only a brilliant strategist and tactician on the battlefield, but also a meticulous, brilliant logistician and mathematician who could calculate all the options. He had to know exactly, down to the kilogram, how much food he had available at any given moment, how many days of marching it would actually last for his troops, and where, when, and how he could replenish his dwindling supplies, through purchase, requisition, or looting. Without this knowledge, any campaign would turn into an adventure and suicide, doomed to failure due to starvation long before meeting the enemy. This grandiose supply system required impeccable military organization at all levels, strict accounting, and iron discipline on the part of those carrying it out. Every pound of precious grain was literally accounted for in the quartermaster's records. Any theft of provisions from the supplies or criminal negligence in critical matters of army supply was punished most severely, up to and including the death penalty, as it endangered the entire army. Discipline in the rear was no less important than at the front, and its violation was not forgiven to anyone, regardless of rank. The Roman army was historically the first large army in the world to approach the complex issue of supply from a scientific, mathematical point of view, rather than in an artisanal manner. They methodically transformed the chaos and improvisation of war into a strictly ordered bureaucratic system of tables of norms, route calculations, and delivery schedules. It was this invisible but effective bureaucratic supply machine, working without fail, and not just the sharp swords of the gladiuses and long spears of the legionaries, that conquered half of the known world for eternal Rome. Logistics was Rome's secret weapon, unseen on the battlefield, but decisive in the outcome of wars long before the fighting began. What modern logistical task of the 21st century do you think can really compare in terms of complexity and criticality to the daily provisioning of a huge Roman army on a months-long campaign through enemy territory without railways or trucks? Write your well-reasoned answers in the comments below. It will be interesting to discuss the parallels between ancient and modern times. Are you ready to learn the truth about what legionnaires actually ate to conquer the world? The basis of the diet, the foundation of the entire food system of the Roman army, was grain, or frumentum. It was not just the main dish, but the #1 strategic resource valued on a par with weapons. The choice of grain was not accidental. First, it is incredibly nutritious and high in calories, which was necessary for people who marched many kilometers every day in full gear. Second, and most importantly, grain can be stored for a very long time and is easy to transport. Unlike fresh meat or vegetables, sacks of wheat or barley could travel for months in a convoy or lie in warehouses without losing their properties. This made it an ideal product for long military campaigns. It was the stability of grain supplies that ensured the army's combat readiness. Most often, legionnaires received hard wheat varieties. However, in some regions, such as the northern provinces, the basis of the diet could be less capricious barley. As a punishment, offending soldiers could be transferred to a barley ration, which was considered humiliating. Grain was given to soldiers on ground. This was done for preservation reasons, as flour spoils much faster. Each soldier or small group of 8 people, contubernium, carried a hand-operated rotary mill. The process of turning grain into food was part of the soldiers' daily routine. The legionnaires ground their own daily ration, producing coarse flour. This was hard physical labor after a tiring day's march. Several basic dishes were prepared from the flour obtained. The simplest was pulse, a thick porridge, a kind of ancestor of Italian polenta. It was filling and did not take long to prepare. A more preferable option was bread or hard biscuits, panis militaris. They were baked in field ovens which were built in the camp or simply on hot stones. Such bread was hard and coarse, but it did not go stale for a long time and was convenient to take with you. Thus, the sound of rotating millstones was as familiar a sound in a Roman military camp as the clang of weapons or the commands of centurions. It was a sound that symbolized stability and order. As long as the legionaries had grain, the army was alive. But grain is only fuel. What if I told you that every legionnaire carried a secret ingredient that turned bland porridge into a warrior's food and even served as a form of payment? I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the Roman soldier's flask. In addition to grain, there were three other components that were absolutely essential to every legionnaire. These were salt, olive oil, and wine vinegar. A simple but vital trinity without which the soldier's diet would have been incomplete. Salt, sal, was not just a seasoning. In hot climates, it was necessary to replenish electrolytes lost through sweat during marches and battles. A lack of salt could lead to rapid fatigue and reduced combat effectiveness. In addition, salt was an important preservative. It was used to preserve meat and fish, which allowed for the creation of protein reserves. The importance of salt was so great that the words soldier and salary, pay, come from the Latin sale. Olive oil, oleum, was a source of essential fats and extra calories. It was added to porridge and used for frying, making food more tasty and nutritious. The oil was transported in large amphorae, and soldiers carried it with them in small leather or metal flasks. In addition to its nutritional value, oil also served a hygienic function. In the absence of soap, soldiers used oil to clean their skin. They rubbed it on their bodies and then scraped it off along with the dirt using a special scraper called a strigil. The third and perhaps most interesting element was wine vinegar, acetum. Soldiers never drank raw water from untested sources. Instead, they mixed it with a small amount of vinegar. This drink was called pasca. Thanks to its acidic properties, vinegar disinfected the water, killing dangerous bacteria. In addition, pasca was excellent for quenching thirst and toning the body, which was invaluable during exhausting marches. Thus, each legionnaire's flask contained not just water, but a healthy and safe drink. It was pasca that was offered to Jesus on the cross by a Roman soldier, which indicates its widespread use. This simple drink saved more soldiers' lives than any medic. This trio, salt, oil, and vinegar, was as standard an element of a soldier's ration as grain. Together, they turned simple food into a life support system. They maintained the health, hygiene, and morale of the legions. It was attention to such seemingly minor details that set the Roman army apart. They understood that the strength of a legion depended not only on the sharpness of their swords, but also on the right balance of salt and fat in each soldier's body. What you are about to learn was the main paralyzing fear and nightmare of any settlement that found itself in the path of the advancing Roman army. Even the most sophisticated, well-organized system of centralized supply from bases was physically incapable of providing a huge army with absolutely everything it needed, especially when operating far from reliable supply bases deep in enemy territory. Therefore, the most important and critical part of Roman military logistics was the army's developed ability to live off the land. That is, to make maximum use of any available local resources in the captured territory. This was not cruelty, but a cold military necessity for survival, which the Romans turned into a system and a science. This process of resource extraction took two main forms, depending on the status of the territory: organized food collection and forced requisitioning from the population. Foraging, or pabulatio in military Latin, was the organized military collection of fodder, hay and grain, for hungry animals in the baggage train, and in cases of acute necessity, additional food for the soldiers themselves above the norm. Large detachments of foragers from several cohorts were specially assigned to these dangerous operations under the reinforced armed protection of cavalry and archers. Without protection, foragers were easy prey for partisans, so safety was a priority. These detachments methodically combed the entire area around the camp, within a radius of several kilometers, in search of grain in barns, hay in the fields, wood for fires, and absolutely anything that could be of any use to the army for survival. Such operations were extremely risky and dangerous, as the scattered foragers were extremely vulnerable to sudden attacks from mobile enemies lying in ambush. It was during routine foraging operations away from camp that bloody skirmishes and ambushes often occurred, which could unpredictably escalate into full-scale battles between the main forces. Commanders had to constantly balance the need to obtain provisions with the risk of losing men in skirmishes, which required caution and reconnaissance of the area before sending out foragers. When the army was on the territory of Rome's official allies or in a loyal, pacified province under control, a more civilized system of compulsory requisitions through the local administration was used. Local communities and cities were legally obliged to supply the passing Roman army with food, fodder, and other necessary resources on demand. These forced deliveries were usually formally paid for from the military treasury, although often not at a fair market price, but at a lower government price. This was a heavy burden for the local population, but refusal was impossible without the risk of repression and accusations of rebellion against Rome. The entire requisition process was strictly regulated by military law and instructions to prevent chaos. The quaestor of the legion or another responsible quartermaster officer officially presented written demands to the local civil authorities, specifying the exact number of sacks of grain, head of cattle, or amphorae of wine, along with the date of delivery. Deliberate failure to comply with these mandatory requirements without good reason could result in severe sanctions, including the arrest of elders, fines, and even military occupation of the rebellious community. Rome did not forgive disobedience, even from its allies, when it came to supplying the army. If the army was in openly hostile, unconquered enemy territory, the organized collection of food quickly turned into outright looting and pillaging. Soldiers ruthlessly took absolutely everything they could find and carry away: grain, livestock, wine, clothing, without any concern for compensating the owners. This was not only a pragmatic way to feed a hungry army at the expense of the enemy, but also a deliberate military tactic to weaken the enemy economically by depleting its resource base. The scorched earth deprived the enemy army of the ability to exist in its own rear, forcing it to retreat or starve along with the civilian population, which undermined the will to resist. The ability to effectively and maximally utilize the available local resources of the captured territory was one of the key qualities of a successful military commander and strategist. He had to carefully plan the optimal route for the entire army in such a way as to purposefully pass through fertile, rich areas with crops where it was possible to safely replenish dwindling supplies, avoiding deserts. The map of a military campaign was also a detailed map of the region's available food resources by season. A bad commander led his army through barren lands and doomed it to starvation, while a good commander planned the route as a chain of supply replenishment from one source to another. To gather critical information in advance about the actual availability of provisions ahead along the planned route, experienced explorers and undercover spies were regularly sent out. They reported to the command not only on the number and location of enemy forces for tactical purposes, but also on the current state of the harvest in the fields, the approximate number of livestock in the herds, and the exact location of large grain stores for capture. This detailed logistical information about resources was almost as important for planning the operation as tactical data about enemy fortifications and garrisons. Without knowing where to get food, the army could not plan an offensive, no matter how weak the enemy was. Thus, the Roman army on campaign constantly balanced between centralized supply from distant bases, via supply trains, and active use of captured local resources on the spot. This strategic flexibility and adaptability allowed it to operate autonomously and effectively for long periods of time away from civilization without the risk of starvation. The Roman army was like a giant locust or fire, methodically consuming all available resources in its path to gain the strength to move on to new sources. It left behind a devastated land, unable to feed the next army, whether its own or the enemy's. But what exactly happened when the army was forced to operate in openly hostile or already devastated territory, where it was physically impossible to obtain provisions locally due to a lack of resources? In the next important chapter, we will take a detailed look at how the extensive Roman supply lines from the bases to the front worked in practice and what problems they solved. All the legendary power and impressive speed of the Roman legions were inextricably and paradoxically linked to their main strategic vulnerability: their cumbersome baggage train. The baggage train, or impedimenta in military Latin, which literally means obstacle, was a huge, slow-moving caravan of hundreds of creaking carts and thousands of pack animals that leisurely followed the fast-moving army along the roads. It was both their material salvation, ensuring survival, and their Achilles heel, a vulnerable spot for the enemy. Commanders had to constantly balance the need to have supplies with the risk of losing them in an ambush, which made command a complex art of compromise. The diverse composition of the extensive baggage train included absolutely everything that was vitally necessary for the daily life and warfare of an army of many thousands, but which ordinary soldiers were physically unable to carry with them at all times in full gear. These were food supplies for many days: grain, wine, oil, and salt, heavy siege engines that had been dismantled, catapults and battering rams, luxurious leather tents for senior officers, and the command, spare weapons and armor to replace those damaged in battle, and tools for building camps. The heavily guarded baggage train also constantly carried the Legion's treasury, with soldiers' pay in chests, and a field hospital with surgeons for the wounded. The loss of any of these categories of cargo was a serious problem, but the loss of the entire baggage train meant disaster in the end of the campaign. The main irreplaceable draft animals for transporting cargo were hardy mules, hybrids of horses and donkeys, and slow but strong oxen harnessed to carts. Mules were preferred and more valuable to the army because they were much more enduring on long marches and faster than the slow oxen, but they required better quality feed and care. The use of thoroughbred horses for the mundane task of transporting heavy loads was very rare and wasteful, as they were too valuable as war animals for elite cavalry and couriers. A horse cost many times more than a mule and required much better care, so they were reserved for battle rather than for transporting sacks of grain. Each basic unit of 8 soldiers, called a contubernium or companionship, had its own mule in the army wagon train for general needs. This pack mule carried a large leather tent for 8 people weighing dozens of kilograms, a heavy hand mill for grinding grain, copper pots for cooking over a fire, and other heavy common household items. Thus, even at the level of the smallest tactical unit of 8 people, an effective system of fair distribution of cargo between people and animals was thought out. This shows how detailed the Romans were in their approach to logistics at all levels of organization, from the contubernium to the legion. The slow movement of the cumbersome baggage train dramatically slowed down the speed of the entire army as a whole. If a trained legion, traveling light without a supply train, could energetically march up to 30-35 kilometers a day on a good road, then with a full heavy supply train, the speed inevitably fell by almost half to 15-20 kilometers. Commanders were constantly faced with a painful tactical dilemma: to move quickly and flexibly, but with the serious risk of dangerously falling behind the slow supplies and being left without food, or to move slowly and cautiously, but with a reliable guarantee of uninterrupted supply to the army. Each decision had its own risks and advantages, and the choice depended on the specific tactical situation, the proximity of the enemy, and the availability of local resources for foraging. A stretched-out convoy was extremely vulnerable to sudden enemy ambushes. Stretched out for several kilometers along a narrow road, a caravan of carts and animals was practically an ideal defenseless target for lightning-fast cavalry ambushes and partisan attacks from the forest. Therefore, it was always carefully guarded by specially assigned combat units from cohorts and cavalry, and on the march it was strategically located in the protected center of the marching column, under the reliable protection of legions in front and behind. Attacking the supply train was considered a priority target for the enemy, as the destruction of supplies would disable the army without a fight, forcing it to retreat or surrender from starvation. Managing such a huge and complex enterprise was an incredibly difficult administrative task that required experience. Special quartermaster officers and their assistants were responsible for the baggage train and its safety, while it was physically serviced by numerous non-commissioned servants and workers known as colones, or drivers. They were professional animal drivers, skilled craftsmen who repaired carts and harnesses, and did all the heavy manual labor in the camp, chopping wood, preparing food, digging ditches. Without these support workers, the army could not function, even though they were not formally soldiers and did not participate in combat. The complete loss of the baggage train as a result of an ambush or a panicked retreat was a real disaster for any army and the beginning of the end of the campaign. It meant not only the material loss of critically important supplies and irreplaceable equipment for weeks to come, but also a severe psychological blow to the morale of the soldiers who saw their property destroyed. An army suddenly deprived of its vital tail with supplies quickly became helpless, hungry, and was practically doomed to imminent defeat or a shameful retreat. The history of warfare is full of examples where the loss of the baggage train decided the outcome of a campaign in favor of the enemy without a general battle. Because of all these serious drawbacks and risks, experienced commanders and strategists always tried to reduce the size and weight of the baggage train to a minimum whenever possible. Before a decisive general battle or a rapid forced march, most of the heavy impedimenta could be deliberately left in a fortified camp under the reliable protection of a garrison of wounded and sick soldiers. Such a deliberately lightened mobile army without excess baggage was much faster, more mobile, and more dangerous to the enemy, capable of sudden maneuvers. This gave a tactical advantage in speed, but limited the time of autonomous operations to a few days before returning to the warehouses. Thus, the supply train was a slow, extremely cumbersome, and highly vulnerable element of the army, but without it, the army's long-term existence away from its bases was physically impossible. It was like a lifeline, inextricably linking the mobile legions to their stationary supply bases in the rear. And as long as this critical umbilical cord was not cut by the enemy or broken by overexertion, the mighty Roman war machine continued to work relentlessly and win, sweeping away everything in its path to another victory and expansion of the empire's borders. Want to know the secret that allowed the Roman army to survive any winter in the heart of enemy territory? The answer lies not in weapons, but in the Romans' unique ability to organize space. Each Roman military camp, castra, was not just a temporary shelter, but a carefully planned fortress and, most importantly, a food supply base. The Roman army never stopped for the night without setting up a fortified camp. This process was perfected to the point of automatism. While one group of soldiers was fighting, another was already digging a moat and building a rampart, turning a clear field into an impregnable fortress in a matter of hours. The layout of the camp was strictly standardized. Each unit, from the cohort to the contubernium, had its own permanent place. This allowed them to avoid confusion and quickly assemble in case of an alarm, but it also had logistical significance. Part of the camp was always set aside for storing supplies. Here were temporary warehouses where sacks of grain and amphorae of wine and oil were stored under awnings or in tents. Responsibility for guarding and accounting for these supplies was a top priority. During long campaigns, especially when preparing for winter, the Romans built permanent camps. In such camps, full-fledged grain stores, or horea, were erected. These were true masterpieces of engineering, designed for maximum grain preservation. The design of the horea was thought out to the smallest detail. They were always built on a foundation of stone pillars raised above the ground. This ensured air circulation under the floor, preventing the grain from rotting due to dampness. The walls of the granaries were thick, and the windows were narrow and few in number to keep the interior cool and protect against pests. A complex ventilation system and thoughtful layout allowed huge stocks of grain to be stored for many months. Such warehouses became the heart of the entire campaign. The concept of forward bases was key to Roman conquests. The army did not simply advance, but created a chain of fortified points and warehouses behind it. This made it possible to shorten supply lines and ensure uninterrupted delivery of food to the front. It was thanks to these bases that Caesar was able to spend several years in Gaul without returning to Italy. His army wintered in fortified camps, feeding on supplies accumulated during the summer. In the spring, rested and well-fed, it was once again ready for combat. Thus, the Roman camp was not just a place of rest, but a strategic facility. It was a hub in a complex logistical network that allowed the army to operate autonomously and effectively far from home. The ability to build and supply such bases was one of the main secrets of Roman victories. We have figured out how provisions were stored, but who was responsible for purchasing and delivering them on an industrial scale? In the next chapter, we will meet the unsung heroes of Roman logistics. The success of Roman logistics depended not only on carts and warehouses, but also on a complex administrative system. It was an army of officials, officers, and clerks who managed the enormous flows of food. Without their painstaking daily work, the legions would not have been able to take a single step. The key figure in the entire supply system was the quaestor. He was an elected magistrate assigned to the army who was responsible for all financial and economic activities. It was the quaestor who organized the purchase of food, concluded contracts with suppliers, and managed the treasury. He was a civilian, but he wielded enormous power. He was in charge of all warehouses and supply trains. He kept strict records of all receipts and expenditures, providing reports to the Senate and the commander. At the legion level, military tribunes and the camp prefect dealt with economic issues. They were responsible for receiving supplies from warehouses and distributing them fairly among the cohorts. It was a responsible position that required honesty and organizational skills. Within each cohort and centuria, the distribution of food was handled by centurions and their assistants, the optiones. The optio kept lists of personnel and, based on these, issued the necessary amount of grain. He was a kind of quartermaster for the unit. Records were kept using wax tablets and papyrus. There was an extensive system of records, reports, and receipts. Every sack of grain, every mule, every amphora of wine was documented. This bureaucracy made it possible to control vast resources and prevent theft. Although corruption certainly existed, the system was designed to minimize it. Every officer in charge knew that he would be held accountable for any shortages. The process of procuring food was organized in different ways. In peacetime, the army relied on supplies from civilian contractors, negotiatores. They delivered food to the borders or to large military bases. During wartime, as already mentioned, the requisitioning system prevailed. But even in this case, everything that was seized was carefully documented. This was important for subsequent financial settlements and for maintaining order. Thus, Roman logistics was not just the transportation of goods, but a complex administrative machine. It required literacy, accuracy, and a strict hierarchy. It was this invisible army of administrators that ensured the smooth operation of the visible army of soldiers. Without these people in togas and with styluses in their hands, the legions would have gone hungry. Their work is not celebrated in poems, but it was as important a contribution to victory as valor on the battlefield. In addition to food, there was another resource without which the army could not survive for a single day: water. Unlike grain, water could not be stored for long periods of time or transported in large quantities. Therefore, access to sources of clean drinking water was the main factor determining the route and schedule of the army's movements. Planning any campaign began with a map of water sources. Scouts sent ahead had to not only assess the enemy's strength, but also find rivers, lakes, and wells. Without guaranteed access to water, the army simply could not move. The ideal place for a camp was near a river. A river provided not only drinking water, but also the opportunity for hygiene and watering for a huge number of animals. In addition, a river could serve as a natural defensive line. In arid regions where rivers were scarce, finding water became a priority. The army moved from well to well. Capturing and holding such sources was a key tactical task. The Romans were excellent engineers and knew how to find water, even where it seemed to be unavailable. They could determine the presence of groundwater by vegetation and terrain. If necessary, soldiers dug wells to provide water for the camp. As already mentioned, the Romans rarely drank raw water. Preparing a drink called pasca from water and vinegar was standard procedure. It was a simple and effective method of disinfection that protected the army from intestinal infections, which were the scourge of many armies in ancient times. The army's water needs were enormous. Each soldier needed several liters a day for drinking and cooking. Thousands of animals in the supply train also required daily watering. Water was also used for technical purposes. It was necessary for smithies, where weapons were repaired, and for tanneries. Without sufficient water, life in the camp simply came to a standstill. Sometimes water shortages were used as a weapon. A besieging army could block or poison the sources supplying a city. In turn, defenders could poison wells along the enemy army's route, using a scorched earth tactic. Thus, the struggle for water was as important a part of war as the struggle for territory. Control of water resources gave a huge strategic advantage. The Roman army, with its engineering skills and discipline, was better at solving this problem than any of its opponents. Although grain formed the basis of the diet, The legionaries' diet was not exclusively vegetarian. Meat and other products were an important addition that added variety, boosted morale, and provided the body with essential proteins. However, the availability of these products depended heavily on the conditions of the campaign. Meat was not part of the standard daily ration. Most often, soldiers received it after sacrifices, which were regularly performed in the camp. Meat was also distributed as a reward for bravery or in honor of a major victory. One source of meat was hunting. In the wooded regions of Europe, hunting parties could hunt deer, wild boar, and other game. This was not only a supplement to the diet, but also good training for the soldiers. The army often drove herds of cattle, sheep, and goats behind them. This was a kind of live canned food that provided fresh meat away from the bases. However, keeping such herds required additional fodder and shepherds, which complicated logistics. The most common type of meat in the soldiers' diet was pork, especially in the form of salted lard or bacon, laridum. It stored well, was very high in calories, and was easy to transport. A piece of lard could make any porridge much tastier and more filling. Another important source of protein was cheese, cassis. Cheese, especially hard varieties, keeps for a long time and is easy to transport. It was a familiar part of the diet and was often served with bread. Vegetables and fruits were seasonal and regional additions. During campaigns, soldiers gathered everything edible they could find: wild apples, berries, mushrooms. Near cities and settlements, it was possible to buy or requisition cabbage, onions, garlic, and legumes. Onions and garlic were valued not only for their taste, but also for their antiseptic properties. They were an essential part of the diet and were considered a means of preventing disease. Roman soldiers were well acquainted with their pungent smell. In coastal regions or near large rivers, fish could be added to the diet. It was salted, dried, or smoked to preserve it for a long time. It was a valuable source of protein and phosphorus. Thus, although the legionnaires' diet was simple, it was fairly balanced for its time. It was flexible and adapted to local conditions. The main principle was to provide soldiers with the maximum amount of calories at minimum cost for transportation and storage. Ultimately, for Rome, logistics was not just a supply system, but a weapon in its own right. The ability to feed their armies far from home gave Roman commanders a strategic advantage that often proved decisive in victory. Superiority in supply was as important as superiority in tactics or weaponry. A classic example of the use of logistics as a weapon was sieges. The Romans could lay siege to an enemy city for months because their own supply system worked like clockwork. While the defenders starved, the legions received regular rations. The famous Siege of Alesia, where Caesar won a decisive victory over the Gauls, was essentially a logistical operation. He not only besieged the city, but also built a second line of fortifications against the approaching Gallic army. He won because he was able to feed his soldiers in this difficult situation longer than his enemy. The Romans also masterfully used the scorched earth tactic against their enemies. When retreating, they destroyed crops and food supplies so that the advancing enemy army would find itself in a devastated territory. This deprived the enemy of the opportunity to live off the land and doomed them to starvation. In turn, Rome's enemies often tried to attack its most vulnerable points: supply lines and convoys. The Parthian cavalry and Germanic tribes avoided open battles with the legions. Instead, they attacked foragers and caravans, trying to cut off the arteries that fed the Roman army. Rome's ability to project its military power over vast distances was directly linked to its logistical capabilities. No other army in the ancient world could conduct such long and large-scale campaigns so far from its borders. They could fight in Scotland, Mesopotamia, and on the edge of the Sahara precisely because they knew how to deliver food there. The construction of the famous Roman roads was not only important for trade, but also had huge military significance. The roads allowed not only troops, but also supply convoys to be moved quickly. Each new road built was an artery through which the power of Rome flowed. Thus, the history of Roman conquest is largely the history of the triumph of Roman logistics. They understood that an army marches on its stomach. Their empire was built not only with the sword, but also with a sack of grain. It was this meticulously thought-out system that allowed Rome to become the ruler of the Mediterranean. It was a solid foundation on which all its military power rested. Ultimately, Rome defeated its enemies even before the battle began, winning the invisible war for food. We can see that the Roman army's supply system was a true marvel of organization, engineering, and administration. It was a complex mechanism in which every detail, from a soldier's handmill to a questor's reports, played an important role. Rome turned a simple need for food into a powerful tool of conquest. A standardized diet based on grain, salt, oil, and vinegar provided soldiers with everything they needed to survive and fight. A flexible combination of centralized supplies, use of local resources, and the creation of fortified bases gave the Roman army unmatched autonomy and endurance. Legions could operate in enemy territory for years while remaining fully combat-ready. The history of Roman logistics is a vivid reminder that behind great victories and legendary commanders, there is always the titanic labor of thousands of invisible people and a flawlessly functioning system. It was this system that was the backbone of the Roman military machine, allowing it to conquer the known world. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new research into the mysteries of the past.